Is there more to the fight against plastic pollution in the ocean than just cleaning up beaches and trying to take plastic out of the system? We're going to find that out today with my guest, Bonnie Monteleone, who is the executive director of Plastic Ocean Project. She is here to talk about how she got into ocean plastics, why she did it, what inspired her to do something about it, and what her organization does to fight against plastic pollution in the ocean. We're going to find out what she does on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's podcast, we are joined by Bonnie Monteleone, who is the executive director of the Plastic Ocean Project. You're probably wondering, I've never really heard of this organization before. You might have. I don't know. I had never heard of this organization until Bonnie and her team reached out to me to tell her conservation story, which is all about plastic pollution. In this interview, we talk about how Bonnie got involved in marine conservation, what inspired her to tackle the fight against plastic pollution, and how she does it. It's a very innovative and different way of approaching plastic pollution in the ocean. We talk about chemistry. We talk about the makeup of plastics and the different plastics. We talk about working with businesses to really understand what's in their plastics so that they can be more sustainable. Talk a lot about different projects, how students are involved, and what you can do to decrease your plastic footprint on the world. So this is a fun episode. Bonnie was great. I just wanted to kind of give you a little heads up that the audio quality that turned out for Bonnie wasn't the best. It's good. It wasn't the best. So there's a couple of blips here and there. So I just want you to be aware of that. I apologize for that. I tried to work it as much as possible. Just sometimes the internet is the internet, and you can't do much about connection. But we hope that you enjoy this interview with Bonnie Monteleone, the Executive Director of Plastic Ocean Project. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Bonnie, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about plastic pollution?
I'm so ready, Andrew. Thank you for this invitation. We're going to talk about how we can do that today. My favorite topic.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about this. This is something that I feel we need to talk more about. And I haven't been able to talk about plastic pollution in a while, just because I haven't had the right people on to talk about plastic pollution. It's always something that is in the background. I mean, we know plastic pollution in the ocean is everywhere around the world, and in every ocean, it touches the depths to the shallows, and it's something that we need to talk more about to get more people aware of how they can, one, reduce their amount of plastic pollution, or just single-use plastic usage and plastic usage in the first place, but also what to do when they talk to their local representatives and their state representatives and their federal representatives about bills and things that should be enacted to reduce these single-use plastics that are being used quite a bit. So I'm excited to talk to you and to talk about your organization and what you've been able to accomplish and what's going to come in the future. But before we get into that, Bonnie, why don't you just let the audience know who you are and what you do?
The Executive Director of Plastic Ocean Project. And this particular nonprofit came out of work I started as a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. So I have 3 years of open ocean research, traveled nearly 10,000 nautical miles, visited some very remote places on the planet, including islands, and just seeing the scourge of plastic in these regions where there aren't people, but there's animals. Yeah, I couldn't just write my thesis and defend it. I had to start a nonprofit so I could educate people, not only what I witnessed, but how do we get people engaged to witness what I've witnessed? So we now have a full-on research facility. We bring students from all ages into our lab. We teach them how to study for plastic, and most importantly, how to positively determine if a particle is plastic. And we use some pretty sophisticated instrumentation. So this is a great way for students to learn science, and then they can put on their resume that they worked with this instrumentation. So giving them a huge leg up. I started this work when I was 48 years old. So this gives them a running start, and hopefully these young people, these ambassadors that we're creating, are going to facilitate the change that needs to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, good for you for not only starting this. I mean, we know starting an organization is not easy, especially in today's world, and then continuing that going along is a difficult aspect. I'd like to know. You mentioned at the beginning that you traveled around the world. Why did you decide to do that? Was that part of your thesis, or was that just something that you're an explorer, you're an adventurer, you like to go to different places in the world, or a little bit of both?
Actually, it kind of blindsided me. So I went back to school to get my master's to be a scientific writer. That was my main objective.
Okay.
But I had learned about Charlie Moore. He's the one that gets the credit for
Hmm.
finding the North Pacific garbage patch. And his story captivated me so much that I wanted to know if it was true. So in 2009, I joined him in his 10-year resampling of the North Pacific, traveling on a 50-foot catamaran for 30 days. And I got to see the garbage patch with my own eyes. And that led to me writing my thesis comparing what I would find in the North Atlantic compared to the North Pacific. So that brought 3 years of
Mm.
analyzing plastics in the North Atlantic, then the South Atlantic, then the South Pacific. So 4 of the 5 gyres. And it was really just disheartening to see plastics, not only finding little particles in the digestive tracts of fish and sea turtles, but also finding plastics with bite marks, right? So it's not just stuff that's also being ingested. So, yeah, that's where my journey started. And it really was because I learned about someone else's story. And I think this is a really important thing, Andrew, is that we do find what we are passionate about through others mostly, right? We want to learn more on this podcast because you cared about the ocean and you wanted to
Mhm.
know answers. And that's exactly what led me to do the work that I do.
it's it's really interesting to hear that you went to like the Pacific garbage patch, and then all of a sudden you're like, I'm gonna go see what's in the North Atlantic. I see the comparison there, because you're from the East Coast, correct? So you're probably wondering, okay, what's in this Atlantic that I've been growing up beside and being able to see quite a bit. And you go into North Atlantic and you see very similar, behaviors and similar types of plastic in terms of microplastic, all different types of plastics. What inspired you to go to the other gyres around the world?
So in 2008, 2009, this topic was just starting to bubble. The wave, right? The wave was forming and people becoming very curious about plastic in the ocean. And because of that, there were many different research opportunities happening simultaneously. So at the same time, Five Gyres Institute, they started a program where they were going to visit all 5 gyres. And people probably don't know what a gyre is. Maybe they do because you have a smart audience. It works. So the gyre is really just the circulation systems in the ocean. Just like our blood needs to be pumped and moved, the water around the ocean has to be moved from one location to another. And how it does that is through currents and wind. So in the middle of these conveyor belts of hold on a second, in the along the continental slope, right? So as they're traveling around the this area of okay, let me redo that part. Uh, okay, so people might want to know what a gyre is,
That's fine,
right?
no problem.
So basically, water is running off of land through rivers and streams and waterways. And then in these currents travel along the continental rim of certain areas. So the North Pacific has a series of currents. And in the middle of those currents is typically a high pressure system. And what that means is that there's very little weather unless a storm comes through. So it's very becalmed. I like to describe it as like a round swimming pool, right? We've all like ran around the edge of a round swimming pool, leaves on the top of that pool. Those leaves would migrate to the center because there's the least amount of resistance. And that's what's happening in our oceans, except that like the North Pacific is 10 million square nautical miles, right? It's a gigantic area. And because there's so much population on that continental rim, there tends to be more plastic. Makes sense, right? North Atlantic was a very different animal. So there's this free floating algae, it's called sargassum. And in fact, it got its name from Columbus. When he was sailing across the Atlantic, he came across this algae that he had never seen before. And when he had it pulled on board to look at it, he saw these little air bladders that look like grapes. It's those air bladders that allow the sargassum to float. Now, why am I telling you all this? This seems like I'm way off topic right now, right? But I'm not. So here's the really cool thing. So the sargassum that accumulates in the North Atlantic floats on the surface, and so does the plastic, right? So it's influenced by wind and current. And the sargassum is an essential fish habitat, meaning it's protected by law, because this is where our juvenile fish and sea turtles go in order to forage and go for protection. So this research led me to understand that perhaps plastic in the North Atlantic might be more detrimental to sea life because these juvenile species get access to the plastic sooner in life than they might in the North Pacific. So this is a really important part of the work that we do.
Yeah, it's amazing, and to be able to get that explanation is great, because I don't think my audience has heard that explanation from me or anybody else. So I think I love the looking at the sargassum, because we know those are floating mats of fish habitat a lot of the times. And you see sea turtles that hang out there, small sea turtles. And not only is it a hiding place in the open ocean, but it's a very important aspect for food and things like that. And to have plastics and garbage essentially float with that can be a huge risk to those animals who end up ingesting it, or getting entangled in it, or what have you. And that can be very difficult. So you go on these trips, and you decide, okay, I need to do something about this. This is something that you're working with Five Gyres. You've met Captain Moore. All of a sudden you're like, okay, I need to do something. And so why like an NGO? Like, why a nonprofit organization?
Yeah. Instead of a business? That's a really good question, right? So I'm just going to throw out an example of a business. So Four Oceans, right? These are two young men that also stumbled on a problem and then wanted to come up with a solution.
Mm-hmm.
Nonprofit, they're a for profit. They sell bracelets to get money to pick up the trash. So finding something that they love to do and also making a profit. I didn't go down that road, Andrew. Mostly because I wanted more answers, right? So this is what science is all about. It's a rabbit hole. And first it was asking happening in the North Atlantic, right? And then with that, learning more about the plastics and what are those implications? Is it just ingestion? Is it just causing harm physically? Are there chemical harms that are also being created from plastics? So my road went down a different path, and that was the path of science, because I recognized the need for independent labs to so we can get an understanding of what material we're working with, and then how do we solve the plastic paradox. It's such great material. As my friend Nina Butler likes to describe it, it makes us superhuman, right? Because of plastic, we can breathe underwater, we can go into space, but we are really living out these things because this plastic really has no place to go. And it's ending up in places that it doesn't belong, and it's causing an enormous amount of harm. So that's what I focus on, is how do we reduce the impacts of plastics, whether it be the physical properties or the chemical properties.
And to do that with science, you have to understand the harm it's causing to animals, to marine life, to habitats, and so forth. So, your programs, you mentioned, you use a lot of sophisticated, instrumentation to be able to quantify and detect microplastics and other types of plastics, in different areas. Can you describe some of the programs, like some of those science programs, a little bit more detail, so the audience can kind of get a bit of a brief summary of what those programs? Because you do quite a bit, in science, and so it'd be interesting to hear for them to hear that.
Yes, so it's been a rising issue, but also like how do you detect if something is actually plastic or not. So just to give you a good to look at plastics ingested by black sea bass. So we collected 102 black sea bass, and we did it in the most um, gentlest way, if you will. So, working with commercial fishermen, asking them to give us the digestive tracts of the black sea bass that they were collecting. And we pulled out 73 particles that looked like plastic, right? So, we're thinking, okay, these fish ate these pieces of plastic. We could have just left it there and we could have wrote a paper and said that most likely these were plastics, but it's not right. So we purchased an instrument. The particle is indeed synthetic or not. And using this technology, it's a Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. It's a mouthful. We call it FTIR, thank goodness for short. um, we are able to positively identify if those particles are plastic. So, of the 73 particles, 53% were actually plastic. And that's really stage, and we've already got people up in arms over this plastic crisis. So, if we're going to call something plastic, we want to make sure that's what it is. So, through this instrumentation, we're able to then educate any child from fifth grade on up to postdocs on how to use this instrumentation, how to read spectra, what are we looking for, and what new discoveries can we find that has this instrument along the East Coast. So now we're getting even companies to reach out to us and say, hey, look, we're working with this product. Can you tell us what's in it? And this is how we're going to solve this plastic problem, using young people to learn about plastics and the makeup of plastic, but also how can corporations that might want to know what's in products that they're using. So it's a pretty awesome opportunity. And I think it's going to be the gateway. But we need independent labs because as we know, FDA, EPA, they can't keep up with the amount of chemistry that's putting put on their shelves.
Yeah, it's that's really interesting to hear that, especially that relationship with the companies who are putting out some of these plastics, and to have that relationship and say, "Hey, this is what's in it." You know, let's have that talk, because a lot of the times when we look at in the environment and impacts to the environment, and then when companies are involved, they get very um they kind of put up walls, right? They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to, be associated with destroying the environment. It's bad PR. It's bad for them. How did you approach the companies, where you're saying, hey, I know you use plastics. Here's what we have. Here's the data we have. How's that relationship started?
Mostly through publications, scientific publications. So right now our team has about 6 publications so that they're seeing the work that we're doing, the success rate that we're having. Word of mouth is another way. We have had some companies that, promote their product as being great. Send me your product and I'll check it out, and they go away, right? So there's a lot of greenwashing as well. So it's working with companies that are trying to come up with ways to better recycle. So just for an example, I got a call yesterday from a company that wants to see about when they clean plastics, is plastic coming off of the mere process of washing it? Great question. Because they're like, we don't want to contaminate the water. So if there's a way for us to filter out the plastics, but they first have to know if they're there. So they're sending us samples of the water from after the wash. So we can then use our instrument to see if there's more plastic, if there's less plastic, just if there's any. And these are the questions we have to ask as we continue down this road because, quite frankly, Andrew, we're probably not going to get rid of it. We're hoping to get rid of a lot of the plastic, but it's so we just have to figure out ways to work with it better and keep it in a circular system so it doesn't end up where it doesn't belong.
Yeah, I agree with that. We definitely need to change our system now. Our worldwide system now. It's something that, um, it's almost like it's frustrating when you hear about it. I don't think a lot of people expect, a lot of the myths of recycling and how non-circular our economy is when it comes to plastic, because there's so many different types of plastic. and there are different ways to recycle them. And what I always found surprising was there had to be a market to be able to do that. Somebody had to be willing to purchase the byproducts of that recycling, and if they weren't, or if there wasn't a market, then that would just end up going to the landfill, which kind of just pulled the hood over all of our eyes, as citizens who are trying to do better, in different countries, to be able to recycle and be able to live more of a circular economy. um, and so it's interesting to be able to work with a group, and have companies work with a group to say, okay, this is, here are the plastics that you have, here's how good or bad it could be, and this is, do you suggest improvements to the plastics or the types of materials that are better?
Um, it- to your point, there's so much chemistry that goes into these plastics, and the wild, wild west of chemistry. This is part of the reason why we can't recycle a lot of the plastics, is because there's such a crazy mix that you never know what you're really going to end up with. The other side of the problem is that, the plastics industry and the oil industry, they want to sell virgin plastics. And the virgin plastics are just much cheaper. So we do need legislation. How can recycled content that does cost more money is is something that companies can purchase at the same price, at the very least, the same price as virgin plastics. And that's really one of the metrics that's way off. And so any company that is using recycled content is usually shelling out more money. And so therefore, and supporting them. It really is, it comes down to our power is through our dollars, and where we spend our money is what we say we want on the shelves. So when we purchase things that have recycled content, we're actually giving those companies a leg up.
Yeah, I totally agree. A lot of the times they end up being a little bit more expensive because they have to spend more money. Their products end up being more expensive, I mean, and because they have to, like, their supply chain goes up. But you're right. I think it is important to support those companies who are doing the best that they can to change, sort of the status quo in terms of their industry. And the one thing, and you kind of mentioned it before, that some companies greenwash. So how would you recommend working with some of these companies? How would you recommend that the research, or what people should do to sort of determine what is greenwashing and what is not?
Good question, because it is so difficult to even know. I do want to get back to your question about the chemical side, right, of the plastics, and then I'll answer that question. But this is another reason why the plastics are so challenging. So, for example, um, we do need to not use BPA. It was actually originally designed to be a female hormone replacement. So it's no question that's an endocrine disruptor. It actually is like estrogen.
Mm,
So we did a study on some BPA bottles to see what they were replacing the BPA with. And are good. They don't use BPS, which is just a variation and actually worse than BPA. That is another way that corporations can get around legislation. But we tested another bottle that had a sticker on it that said BPA free. And when we tested it, it was loaded with BPA. So just to really know what they're getting. So what we recommend is really try not to eat or drink out of
mm,
plastics. And I know how hard that is. I know, as I've lost a lot of weight from not eating out of plastics. And here's why, because you tend to eat more whole foods, right? So whole vegetables packaged in
mm,
plastic. The flimsier the plastics, the more chemicals leach out of it. So there's another reason, right? Polystyrene or styrofoam is one of the worst things that we can eat and drink out of. So when a plastic is heated up, so imagine your styrofoam cup for your hot coffee, right? That styrene is migrating into your coffee, and now you're drinking it, or if you're microwaving it. So it's really about educating the masses on how we can do better and what they should try to avoid. And that's what Plastic Ocean Project is all about. Like, how can we educate people, and in the process, they're putting less plastic in the environment? Because that's really where we have to end up.
and you kind of mentioned it a lot in the work that you do, is the less plastic you use, the more healthy you become. And I think it's an interesting concept. A lot of the times when we go more environmental, you there are a lot of benefits to it, not only to the environment, but there's always benefits to your health, to your financial system. Like, so when people say you go, if you go electric vehicle, well, that helps because you're not paying the astronomical prices for gas, and so there's always benefits in a lot of the times when you're trying to do something good for the environment, not only for the environment but for ourselves as well. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of health benefits to having a reusable cup that is not made from plastic. Stainless steel would probably be better, I assume, and things like that. And one, it's you have it with you all the time. You're probably drinking more water because of it. You're probably drinking less things with sugar in it that are packaged in plastic and so forth. And so you end up being healthier. Plus, you're not drinking out of plastic, which gets into our bodies. And now, even when we know that microplastics can be part of air particles, so it's always coming into our body. The less plastics we have, the better. And so that helps. I love how your organization is really focused on letting people know what to have and what not to have, like what to use and what not to use based on the science that you do, and you're able to communicate that in a very easy way. What is that approach? Like, what types of communication do you use when you start to communicate this type of
Well,
science?
I love that you asked that question. So we lean heavily into the science, but we also lean into the arts. So we feel the arts are equally as important because the arts are what are helping what's happening to our environment. So, we've seen beautiful art pieces made out of plastic trash, right? We've done one, it's actually a sculpture of a woman running, and she's covered in microplastics, and it's called Running Out of Time. What we do to the planet, we do to ourselves, right? So we should always think that we are nature, we're part of nature, we're not separate. And then we need writers, right? We need journalists, and then we need videographers and storytellers. And so one of the ways that we're most now representing our work is through a full length documentary called If the Ocean Could Talk, A Voice for the North Atlantic. So it's going to share all of the research that we've been doing over the past decade, and then sharing the hope, but also the urgency to reduce their use of plastics. Andrew, when I started this work, we used about 300 million metric tons of plastics. That was around 2009. Today, we're using over 430 million metric tons. It's gone up that much in just 10 years. So really it's going in the wrong telling through podcasts can educate people on, though it seems like we might be doing better, we've got a long way to go, and it really is on us. If we don't take it off the shelves, they'll stop making it.
That it's true. I think that's what it really comes down to. I mean, there's the aspect of, from an individual standpoint, where we all can do our part in reducing our use of plastic and containers and so forth to help our health, but also reduce that. But there's also a level where we need to look at government, and we need to look at legislation and policy to stop a lot of these plastics from just being in the supply chain in general, right? Just for our own health, and get it at that level, at that government level where it becomes law, and it becomes policy to be able to do that. Does your organization collaborate with other organizations to work on policy, or do you work on policy
We
yourselves?
have a program right now. It's called Plus Nature, a new economic paradigm shift. And that's loaded. People can go to our website and learn more about it. But just one aspect is working with our government to really start regulating these chemicals that are allowed to be put in plastics. For example, plastic film, that COVID, because we were using so much more of it. It's much more difficult to recycle, but it is a great material because it's so lightweight. If things are packaged in film, it takes up a lot less weight than, say, cardboard. But the amount of chemistry that goes into those plastics, not all plastic film is equal. So that we make it difficult for us to reuse that material. So you may have seen, new forms of building materials like decking, right? Made out of plastic film. So instead of cutting down trees, we're actually repurposing that plastic film that, delivered food to our doors. Um, so it's really about how in mitigating the chemistry, because if we can get the chemistry right, we can get the plastic right. If we can get the plastic right, then we can recycle it more readily and keep it in that circular economy that we so desperately need around plastic waste. And that's where we find our efforts to be most effective.
You mentioned the chemistry. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is it about the change in chemistry that would make it easier to recycle?
Just unifying or uniforming the types of chemicals that we use, right? So, as I mentioned, there are so many, in fact, thousands. There's that maybe is unnecessary, maybe because everyone wants their own formula, maybe because, if you don't have to say what you're putting in it, you can just mix anything together that's on hand. We don't really know because that's proprietary, right? Alls we can do is actually look at the plastics and see what kind of
Right.
every type of plastic typically has some different type of way of it's being put together. So that's where government really has to come in and say, we are going to regulate the types of chemicals, and we may have to just get rid of some of them. PVC is great for pipes, but did you know that we use PVC? It's one of the most toxic plastics, and yet that plastic film, because it helps keep the meat looking pink, they use PVC plastic for covering meat. And it's just that kind of crazy, no, there's certain plastics that should not be, styrofoam being another one. In
Mm.
fact, there was a publication that said that styrofoam should be treated as toxic waste. That's how toxic. So, yes, this is where our government is failing us, especially with this plastic. And when it comes to human health, just how horribly impact plastic is on the human body, especially children. So, a report came out in 2018 by the American Academy of Pediatrics, basically calling out our government to start regulating these chemicals. And that's because children's metabolism runs much faster, so they're more impacted by the chemistry. And they went so far as to say that these chemicals can cause cancer, diabetes, obesity, behavioral disorders, and reproductive issues. And we're seeing all of that. 100 years ago, a young girl wouldn't menstruate until she was 16. And what's one of the common denominators? We are all eating and drinking out of plastic. And so we really should take a hard look at just what exactly this material is, and then how, in the meantime, until we get some regulation, we should all do our best to not eat and drink out of it.
I think the scary thing is, as a parent myself, you look around and you notice a lot of these things. You notice a lot more cancer. You notice a lot, behavioral issues. Um, menstruating at an earlier age, and people always say it's like, yeah, this something must be going on. Everybody talks about it. Like if you're just sitting with some friends and you're having this conversation, you're like, there's got to be something that is in our food or in our materials that we use, whether it be lotions or anything like that. I'm not making any claims or anything, but we always think about that. It's like, what's going on? But then we just go about our day, because for us as consumers, there's really not a lot that other than what the materials on the bottles or containers that we have, which are made out of plastic. We look at that and we really don't understand the health impacts that it could have, because there's nothing really to kind of put out. I can imagine if the government just started to have a list of, here are, what's in every material that you use, and here are the dangers and the risks that you have. I'm sure a lot of people are like, why are we making these materials? Why are these actually in production? But it seems like there's this veil, over our eyes when it comes to, all the different packaging, all the different things, the containers and things. it's extremely frustrating as someone, who tries to, like, you're a parent, you try to protect your kids, but there's only so much you can do. There's only so much without that knowledge. How is it that companies can get away with putting this stuff in our packaging? What really stands out is the PVC material in the film that goes around our meat, which I assume leaches out into the meat at some degree. I'm not making any statements because I haven't read the science or anything, but there's probably some sort of study that looked at that. How does that how is that allowed? In North America, let's just talk about that because that's what we're used to, like in the U.S. and Canada. How is that allowed?
Because there's too much chemistry going on, and our EPA and FDA cannot keep up. And unfortunately, in our country, chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. So that's why you have to have research labs like ours in order to help tease that out. But,
Hmm.
there's just so much of it. Other countries, they have the uh, principle where, you have to first prove that it's not harmful and then you can put it on the shelves. And that's the
Yeah.
difference. We don't have that. We really, sadly, don't have the amount of protection that we deserve in this country. And because of it, because we are now, I think, second in plastic production in the world next to China, we're
Mm,
spreading all of that chemistry everywhere. And again, I don't demonize plastic. I think it has a role,
of course.
but we have a do what we're exposing people to for profits.
Yeah, that's a scary thing. That's a really scary thing when you think about that. But having organizations like yourselves to be able to um, do the studies, go in the lab and be able to rigorously, you know, uh, and scientifically pull out those chemicals and really break down what's in specific plastics. Obviously, you can't do every plastic. You're a lab of a certain size, and it's difficult. But to be able to know that from even a smaller sample set, to say, okay, we need to really look at this and be able to say, okay, let's move into a different, a different realm, and let's start looking at different plastics and different chemistry that can go into those plastics. One thing I want to mention too, and you talked about other countries, it seems like the EU, like Europe, seems to be way ahead of the game in taking out or banning specific chemicals from being, whether in plastics or in products and so forth. Do you ever look at um, materials from Europe and compare them, or just even compare the results of what's in our plastics and what's in theirs, and see the differences?
It's really difficult to even know whose is whose, right? You look at it on the
Mm,
chemistry side of things. So right now, the UN is working on the
yeah.
plastic treaty. And this is, a consortium of leaders and nonprofits and for profits around the world trying to come up with a strategy on how to solve this problem. And we recently joined the Scientist Coalition. And the Scientist Coalition is the science that's working on the chemistry side of plastic. So I do want to shed some light on that there is hope coming. We aren't there yet, but there's a cavalry of scientists that are really going to be making a huge impact on the chemistry in plastics. We're a bit of a ways away from having those answers because it is so complicated, but I encourage people to research that. Scientists Coalition, the UN Plastic Treaty, and this action and Plastic Ocean Project is part of that team.
That's wonderful to hear. I have heard of the UN treaty. I actually we'll probably release the episode right after yours. I spoke to Margaret Spring from Monterey Bay Aquarium. She talked a lot about the UN treaty. My understanding, you talk about positive news, and what she was telling us, and my understanding from that conversation was the fact that there is it's almost like an accelerated format to get the treaty done. I think she was mentioning dates or years as soon as 2025 to get this treaty of a lot of different countries. We're talking not just 10 or 12. We're talking, in the 90s and the over 100 countries, and that's a really great thing to see. And I think we'll see a lot of changes from that. And my understanding too is that the national policy for the US is being developed alongside the treaty. So it's going to follow, hopefully and ideally, it's going to follow a lot of what the treaty is going to demand, so they don't have to do any changes afterwards. So there is positive news in all this, and there's optimism in the future for the use of plastics, for the use of different chemicals that are less harmful to us, less harmful to the environment, less harmful to our oceans, and hopefully a reduction in the amount of, and maybe an increase in the way we manage plastics, and a reduction in the amount that gets out into the ocean and out, harming our animals and harming our habitats and oceans in general. Now, speaking of oceans, I was on your website perusing, doing a little bit of research before you came on, and I did find you guys are in the. I think you're still in the process of, um, creating this documentary, of plastics. And there was an interesting story that really came out from it. There's a trailer on the website, which I'll link all those links that you've mentioned, Bunny, and to so that people can get access to in the show notes. But can you just talk about how the documentary came to be, why you started to do it, and then sort of how it's developing?
Oh, it's one of my favorite stories. Um, so I didn't answer your question thoroughly of all the different ways I got into these different gyres, but in the South Pacific, I was there because I was with the crew. Joe Ruxton being the underwater producer of Blue Planet, the first series. So I was there because I was part of a film project called A Plastic Ocean. And I was pitching to her while we were in Fiji. I was like, I got this idea for a film, right? And she's like, okay. And I brought all my documents showing like we need to talk about the North. We also need to talk about all the unique characteristics because it is so different than the other oceans that I've been to. And so I gave her all the details, and she's like, I'd like to help. She's British. I'd like to help you, Bonnie, but what's your hook? And I'm like, I don't have a hook. She's like, you got to have a hook. And I'm like, I don't have one, but I'm pretty sure one's going to show up, right? So anyway, we're working on the film because we wanted to just do that, right? Talk about the plastic problem, but also solutions, and also about the beauty of the North Atlantic. So it starts out in the middle of the North Atlantic where the sargassum is, and then the sargassum brings us back to Wilmington, or back to North Carolina, where we're now in the Gulf Stream. And that Gulf Stream takes us up to a point in Carolina. It's the farthest landmass in the North Atlantic that juts out from a main landmass. And so, with that, there's this cold water current that comes down and it butts up against the warm water, and then there's the upwelling of the continental slope. So, through my research in trying to learn more about the North Atlantic on the planet, happens to be off our coast. And I want you to think about that, right? I traveled all around the world to find myself back in the Atlantic and then back into North Carolina. So, full circle brought me all the way back home. And learning about this biodiversity and learning about the problems that plastic creates, I thought this is going to be my hook, right? Even offshore, trying to film that biodiversity. And we're talking about 33 cetaceans. That means whales, dolphins, and porpoises that are known to reside or visit this location off our coast. That's more than a third of all of the cetacean species in the world. It's incredibly diverse. And as we continue to learn more about it, it's a biodiverse location, but I'll get to that later. So while we're out filming, just getting some B-roll of whales and such, we stumble across a newborn right whale that's dead on a beach. And the North Atlantic right whale is one of the most endangered whales in the world. And as I was standing next to this newborn, it was that moment when I heard Joe Ruxton say, "What's your hook?" And I found my hook. So the documentary is now around what happened to this newborn right whale, right? We want to know, like, why did we lose this animal? And this animal is so important because the species numbers are in such huge decline. So that's the urgency of our story. And as we explore all of the things that could have happened to this animal, we're also going to be learning about who's trying to solve those problems. So in this film, it's going to be, was it plastic ingestion? Was it plastic entanglement? Was it from shipping all of our plastic all over the world? Was it hit by a ship? Um, was it the chemicals that we use, right? So the runoff from agriculture, which also encompasses an enormous amount of plastic, right? Was it the chemicals from runoff that ends up in the mother's milk? And this was a really sad thing for me to learn. But unfortunately, cetaceans can lose their firstborn because of all the contaminants that end up in the ocean from man made materials. And the firstborn can die from those chemicals in the mother's milk. And if that doesn't rattle people, I don't know what does, because that's just so disheartening. Like, nothing should interfere with mothers. We ask the scientists what could have happened. We're asking what's the solution. And then right then and there, we're not going to wait till the end and say in the last 5 minutes, here's what you can do.
Yeah.
No, you're going to learn right then and there the work, the effort that's going into creating the change that we need to make in order to do better on this planet. You're going to know. I know what I can
Right.
do, and I know why I need to do it. And if we save the North Atlantic right whale, we're actually going to save a lot of the challenges that we're creating on the oceans in general.
Yeah, you said it perfectly there. And I love how you mentioned in the documentary, you're going to be focusing on what people can do during the documentary, not just the last 5 minutes. That seems to be the model for a lot of documentaries that have come out is, you see the wonder, there's a conflict, a whale dying or corals bleaching or whatever that might be in a documentary. And then the last 5 minutes or even into the credits, you see people doing something and to try and give people a little bit of hope. But we need a lot of hope. We need a lot, not only just hope, we need calls to action. We need, people to do things, and also put pressure on government, work with, partner with organizations as individuals and say, hey, how can I help? What can I do? Write stories, talk about it, all that kind of stuff to be able to really change things and really push things in from a government level and in a policy level. And I love to hear that. I really do, because that's one of my big criticisms about documentaries. They put so much into the production, so much into the storyline, but when it comes down to the actual conservation, it shouldn't be the last 5 minutes or into the credits of what is. So I really love that aspect. Buddy, when can people expect that movie to start hitting? I know there's a number of film festivals that I believe it's entered in. Is it Where is it in the production process, and when can we look forward to seeing it?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So, with finding the newborn whale, when we found the newborn whale, it was a moment when we were like, we have a documentary
Mm,
short, and that documentary short can actually then feed into the full length documentary. So the documentary short is 356, and that's had it survived, right? So right now, that documentary short, 356, and it is confusing, has been in 8 film festivals, 3 international, and we're waiting to hear back from 2 more. So that we're going to be releasing as soon as we're done with the film series or
the
the
film.
film
Yeah.
festival series. I do also want to mention, you have to know who Sylvia Earle is. She was the first female aquanaut. She's now in her 80s. She's had thousands of dives. She has a documentary called Mission Blue that's on Netflix.
Beautiful documentary. Beautiful
Yeah, just
documentary.
she's amazing. And so she's also part of our film project. She
Nice.
received and she studied seagrasses and seaweeds, right? So sargassum is very near and dear to her heart. So we hope to go into post production after we get the crescendo of our film. And it's a long shot, but we're working with Sylvia now to get her on the Duke Research bio-rich location off of OBX, which is now called Hope Spot Hatteras. That's one of Sylvia's programs. And to get her seeing the biodiversity
Nice.
that she then helped
Yep.
create and protect, right? So this Hope Spot is part of her program that'll be featured in our to help promote the documentary. So um, the goal is to go into post production in January and then release World Ocean Day, which is June 8th, 2024.
Perfect day to release it. Whenever a lot of people are focused on the ocean, they like to watch things about the ocean, and I think that's a great way to do it. To partner with Sylvia, I've had the pleasure of meeting her and working with her team in the past. a wonderful team. I've never met such a hardworking person in terms of sacrificing her career. If anybody's watched the Mission Blue um, documentary, she was the director of NOAA. She was the person at NOAA, and she didn't think she can do enough as the director, and so she stepped down and started Mission Blue. And to be able to do that from a career standpoint in this business, the sacrifices that she's taken from that, as well as if you watch the documentary, everything else that she's done, um, it's a huge step. It's a huge inspiration to just be like, there is a bigger movement happening in all of us. It's why we go into oceans. It's why you went back to school and did your studies, and now why you're focused so much on plastic pollution. There's something in us that we know it's better to do it this way. And so she has that, and it's going to be great to see that reflected in the film. And I think it's going to be wonderful. I look forward to be able to seeing that on Ocean's Day in 2024 on June 8th, and that's going to be wonderful. So I want to say, Bonnie, this has been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I'm glad we were able to do this interview to get more information out on a very different aspect of plastic pollution. Looking at the chemistry behind it. I think that's something that we need to do more, and you don't see a lot of that information being spread around. So I'm really happy that you came on and we were able to talk about that, and hopefully enlighten, I know, myself as well as our audience in terms of what we should expect and what we should look out for when we do use plastic, and to avoid using it because of not only for our health, but also the health of our planet. So Bonnie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it. Love to have you back on to get updates, not only on the film, maybe to promote the film, and but also on all the other projects, because I know there's probably stuff that we haven't been able to discuss in this short time, but I'd love to have you back on to discuss it again.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think what you're sharing with people is so important. Like, this is the new way of communicating, especially because, and I'm so glad we share this one together. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And thank you for all the work that you do and your organization and your team does. It's wonderful. Thank you.
To be continued.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bonnie, for joining me on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Really great interview. Love what you do. And I want to thank you not only for coming on the podcast and sharing your story, but also for the work that you do. This is the first time that I have interviewed somebody on plastic pollution that's not just cleaning up beaches, which is a phenomenal feat to be able to organize and do that kind of stuff. But she looks at plastics, with the chemistry of plastics. She works with students to get that going and to really understand what plastic is made of, what's recyclable, what's not, maybe eventually how we can get more things recyclable, more things sustainable. And I just love it. I love how she incorporates everything, even getting into the communication aspect of video and just telling people about plastics, I think is super important. The more we're able to talk to people, the more we're able to have conversations with our friends and our family about the things that we need to do to become more sustainable, not in an aggressive way, not in a judgy way, but also just in a good conversation. Having a great conversation with your partner, with your family members, with your friends is extremely important. And that's what we do here each and every episode on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. And I'm really happy that Bonnie was able to join me to really share that experience and share her experience within the marine science and conservation world, especially when we talk about plastic pollution. It is an epidemic. We need to stop this from happening. We need to stop pollution or plastics from getting into the ocean and polluting our waters, even our fresh water. It's got to stop. And so working with organizations like the Plastic Ocean Project is crucial to finding out more about this type of work and how we can conserve our ocean. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, please feel free to contact me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. All one word, at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also go to my website, speakupforblue.com, and you can go to the Contact Us page, send me an email just by filling out the form. All that goes right to me, by the way. Also, if you want to leave a voice message, because I love to hear your voice, you can do so in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a little microphone. You click on that. You record away. Doesn't matter the quality. Doesn't matter if you have a microphone. I'll listen to it. If you don't mind, if I play it, that would be cool. Just letting me know on the next episode if there's a question that I want to answer or a follow-up I want to answer on the next episode or one close after. I'd love to get your permission to do that as well. But other than that, I want to thank you so much to Bonnie and to you for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Feel free to share this with a friend. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.